Blood tastes like old copper pennies and regret. 5 rounds tore through my flight suit before my boots even hit the deck of their cruiser. To the armored bastards staring down at me, I was just another corpse. They chimed their victory over the comms. Target neutralized. They didn't know about the biochem pump buried under my ribs. They didn't know that flatlining was just step 1. Now, the adrenaline protocol is online, and I am wide awake. Wyatt died before the hull breach alarm even finished its second cycle. A piece of the main console, jagged and stinking of melted polymer, sheared off and caught him right under the jaw. I didn't have time to mourn. I didn't have time to do anything but swallow the bile rising in my throat and slam my palm against the emergency bulkheads. The ship was coming apart around us. Gravity plating flickered, sending loose bolts and droplets of Wyatt's blood floating into the cabin like a macabre snowstorm. The smell was the worst part. It wasn't the heroic scent of plasma and starlight they sell you in the recruitment vids. It was scorched hair, ruptured sewage lines, and the sharp, acidic tang of battery acid. I hit the deck hard as the boarding clamps locked onto our hull. The sound vibrated right through my teeth, a deep, metallic groaning that meant we were no longer flying. We were being reeled in. My hands shook as I reached for my sidearm. I wasn't a Marine. I was a pilot. My job was to keep the siren out of firing arcs, not trade shots with whatever the hell was cutting through the airlock. The cutting laser breached the reinforced steel with a high-pitched hiss, blindingly white. Molten slag dripped onto the grated floor, hissing and popping as it cooled. Then the door kicked inward. They poured in, 4 of them, maybe 5. Heavy armor, dull gray and scratched up, moving with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. I didn't even see their faces behind the tinted visors. I just saw the wide, dark muzzles of their kinetic rifles swinging toward me. I pulled my trigger once. The recoil snapped my wrist back, and my shot went wide, sparking off the bulkhead. They didn't miss. The first round caught me in the right shoulder. It felt like being hit by a freight train. The sheer kinetic force spun me around, shattering my collarbone instantly. I didn't even have time to scream before the second and third rounds took me in the chest. Breath left me in a pathetic, wet gasp. My knees gave out. I hit the floor grating, my cheek pressing against the cold, vibrating metal. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the muffled, heavy thud of their boots approaching. 4, 5. 2 more impacts, hot and tearing, ripped through my abdomen. They were making sure. The pain wasn't sharp. It was a vast, crushing weight that pinned me to the floor. My vision tunneled. I could see the scuffed toe of a combat boot step into my field of view. Above me, a distorted voice crackled through a vocabulator, speaking in clipped, guttural tones. I didn't need a translator chip to know they were calling it in. Human pilot. Dead. My lungs refused to expand. I tried to pull in air, but all I got was a wet rattling sound. My blood was pooling beneath me, warm and sticky, soaking through the insulated fabric of my suit. I was dying. I knew it. The cynical part of my brain, the part that always told me signing up for the deep space routes was a mistake, just sighed in resignation. This was it, alone, in a tin can, millions of miles from the smell of actual rain or the taste of cheap coffee. I let my eyes flutter shut. The darkness was surprisingly warm. Then, deep in the cavity of my chest, something clicked. It was a tiny, mechanical sound, a micro valve opening, When Command issued the experimental biochem pumps to Frontier pilots, they told us it was a survival contingency, a final safety net. They didn't tell us it would feel like drinking liquid hellfire. The first injection hit my bloodstream. My eyes snapped open. The world didn't just return, it exploded into agonizing high-definition clarity. A massive dose of synthetic epinephrine, mixed with combat-grade neurostimulants and blood-clotting agents, flooded my system. My heart, which had been slowing to a pathetic flutter, suddenly seized. It didn't beat. It slammed against my ribs like a jackhammer. Thud, 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 thud. The pain in my chest and stomach didn't disappear. It magnified, but the shock of it was bypassed. My nervous system was hijacked. The pooling blood beneath me felt cold. The air smelled of cordite and alien sweat. I could hear the hum of their armor servos, the soft click of their weapons being lowered. They thought I was meat. My fingers twitched. The adrenaline protocol didn't make me a superhero. It just removed the safety limiters my brain put on my muscles, ignoring the fact that my body was full of holes. It felt like my veins were filled with broken glass and battery acid. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, locked in a hyperventilating spasm. I planted my left hand in my own blood. It slipped. I adjusted, digging my fingernails into the metal grating until they bent backward. Slowly, impossibly, I pushed myself up. Air tore into my damaged lungs with a sickening whistle. I didn't rise smoothly. I staggered, my right arm hanging uselessly at my side, my legs shaking so violently I thought my kneecaps would shatter. I coughed, and a spray of dark, oxygen-depleted blood splattered across the nearest hostile's visor. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even the groaning of the hull seemed to pause. The soldiers froze, their weapons lowered, their posture betraying pure, unadulterated shock. Dead things weren't supposed to stand up. I didn't think. Thought was a luxury I couldn't afford. The protocol had hijacked my brainstem, reducing my consciousness to a feral, screaming need to survive. The closest soldier raised his rifle. He was too slow. I lunged. My foot caught on the grating, and I stumbled, turning what should have been a tackle into a clumsy, desperate crash. I slammed my good shoulder into his chest piece. The impact jarred my broken collarbone, sending a blinding flash of white-hot agony through my skull. But the momentum carried us both downward. We hit the deck in a tangle of limbs. He tried to bring his weapon up between us. I slapped the barrel away with the back of my hand, tearing the skin off my knuckles against the hot metal. I didn't care. I grabbed the edge of his helmet, my fingers finding the gap beneath the jawline. I squeezed, leveraging my entire body weight, fueled by a chemical cocktail that was currently redlining my heart into dangerous territory. I ripped the helmet back. The seal popped with a sharp hiss. Beneath the tinted visor was a pale, hairless face, wide eyes reflecting a terror I was too far gone to appreciate. I drove my knee upward, brutally, repeatedly, once into the armor, jarring my own joint. Twice, slipping past the plating and sinking into soft tissue. He shrieked, a high, reedy sound that grated on my hypersensitive eardrums. The others snapped out of their stupor. A kinetic round zipped past my ear, the displacement of air so violent it ruptured my eardrum. Warm blood trickled down the side of my neck, but I couldn't feel the pain. My body was a stolen machine, running on borrowed time and toxic fuel. I rolled off the screaming soldier, dragging his kinetic rifle with me. It was heavy, designed for hands larger than mine, the grip awkward, and the trigger guard too wide. I didn't try to aim properly. I just pointed it at the center of the doorway and squeezed the firing stud. The weapon bucked in my hands like a wild animal. I couldn't control the recoil. The first shot took a soldier in the hip, spinning him around. The second shattered the overhead light fixture, plunging the corridor into strobing emergency red. The third and fourth went into the bulkhead, showering sparks over the boarding party. They scrambled for cover, shouting to each other in that harsh, clicking language. They were trained professionals. I was a bleeding, half-dead pilot throwing a chemically induced tantrum. But I had one advantage. I didn't care if I lived through the next 10 seconds. My vision swam, the edges turning a fuzzy, static gray. The protocol was fighting a losing battle against the sheer volume of blood I was losing. My chest felt wet. Every time I inhaled, it felt like inhaling ground glass. I spat a mouthful of copper-tasting saliva onto the deck and racked the charging handle of the stolen rifle. "Come on," I wheezed, the words barely audible over the roaring in my ears. It wasn't a heroic challenge. It sounded pathetic, desperate. A shadow moved in the strobing red light. I fired blindly. The recoil tore the weapon from my weakened grip, sending it clattering across the floor. I was unarmed again. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, sliding in the pooling fluids on the deck. My back hit the cold metal of the nav console. I reached up blindly, my fingers scrabbling over the familiar switches and dials until I found the heavy, metal fire extinguisher bracketed to the wall. I pulled the release pin with my teeth, spitting it out, and hauled the red cylinder down. A soldier rounded the corner, his rifle leveled right at my face. I didn't hesitate. I swung the extinguisher like a club, aiming not for him, but for the pressurized release valve of the ship's main coolant line running along the ceiling above him. The heavy metal cylinder collided with the pipe. The resulting explosion of supercooled liquid nitrogen was instantaneous. A blinding white cloud of freezing vapor erupted downward. The soldier caught the brunt of it. His armor, designed to dissipate heat, flash froze. He screamed, dropping his weapon and clawing at his visor as the sheer cold began to necrotize his flesh in seconds. I didn't stick around to watch him die. I dragged myself around the console, my legs finally giving out completely. I was crawling now, dragging my ruined body toward the secondary airlock. My heart was stuttering, skipping beats. The synthetic adrenaline was burning out, leaving behind nothing but the catastrophic damage to my organs. I left a thick, smeared trail of red behind me. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. The pain in my chest had transcended physical sensation and become a dull, roaring static in my mind. I reached the airlock keypad. My vision was almost entirely gone. I punched in the override code by muscle memory alone. The door hissed open. I hauled myself over the threshold and slammed my blood-slick hand onto the lock mechanism. The heavy steel door slid shut, sealing with a definitive thump. I collapsed against the wall. The silence of the escape pod bay was heavy, thick. For the first time since the first shot hit me, I allowed myself to stop moving. I looked down at my chest. 5 holes. The blood had started to coagulate, a thick, blackish sludge thanks to the clotting agents. But it wasn't enough. I rested my head back against the cold steel. I was alive, broken, bleeding, and likely going to die in the next 20 minutes. But I was alive. And out there, in the corridor, the boarding party was learning a very hard lesson about what happens when you don't make sure the human is actually dead. Vibrations through the deck plating told me they were already hitting the airlock door with thermal cutters. My cheek rested against the freezing steel of the escape bay deck. I didn't want to move. I really, truly did not want to move. The biochem pump embedded beneath my sternum gave a pathetic, whining whir, like a failing hard drive, and pushed a secondary payload of stabilizers into my veins. It didn't bring back the manic, high-voltage energy of the first dose. Instead, it brought a crushing, hyper-aware lucidity. I could feel the exact shape of the bullets lodged in my chest cavity. I could feel the ragged edges of my punctured right lung scraping against my ribs with every shallow, agonizing breath. "Warning!" the automated voice of the pod bay chimed, its cheerful, synthetic feminine tone completely at odds with the gore smeared across the floor. "Unauthorized access detected at bulkheads. Please secure the perimeter." I let out a wet, rattling laugh that tasted like rust. Secure the perimeter. Right, I'd get right on that, as soon as I figured out how to keep my intestines inside my body. I forced my left arm out, planting my palm against the deck, and dragged my dead weight forward, inch by agonizing inch. The escape pod, a battered yellow cylinder that smelled perpetually of old vomit and stale ozone, was only 10 feet away. It might as well have been in another solar system. Behind me, the heavy steel of the airlock door began to glow a dull, cherry red in the center. They were angry now. You don't just shoot a dead man and expect him to break your friend's neck and freeze your squad leader. They were going to breach that door, and they weren't going to use kinetic rifles this time. They would use plasma. They would turn the entire bay into a blast furnace just to be sure. My fingers scrabbled against the lip of the pod's open hatch. I gripped the hazard-striped handle and pulled. Agony, sharp and unyielding, flared through my right shoulder. The broken collarbone ground together, a sickening wet crunch that echoed in the quiet bay. Black spots danced across my vision, expanding rapidly until I was completely blind for 3 terrifying seconds. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted fresh blood, using the pain to ground myself, to keep from passing out. The protocol in my chest wouldn't let me die, but it wouldn't stop me from losing consciousness if my brain short-circuited from the trauma. I hauled my torso over the lip of the hatch. My legs dragged behind me, limp and useless. I tumbled into the cramped interior of the pod, landing hard on the primary acceleration couch. The impact knocked whatever breath I had left out of me. I lay there, gasping like a landed fish, staring up at the curved, scratched ceiling of the pod. Clang. The airlock door outside buckled. The cherry-red spot was now a blinding, white-hot circle of molten slag. They were almost through. I rolled onto my side, my vision swimming, and reached for the launch console. The buttons were smeared with my own blood. I hit the master power switch. The pod hummed to life, the interior bathed in a sickly, amber emergency light. The life support scrubbers kicked in, blowing stale, cold air directly into my face. Pre-flight sequence initiated, the pod's computer purred. Please strap in. Warning, biometric sensors detect critical passenger trauma. Engaging emergency medical stasis protocols. Override, I croaked. My voice sounded like gravel grinding in a blender. Manual launch, now. Manual launch requires secondary authorization from ship's command, the computer replied. I stared at the console, my heart sinking into the cold, bloody mess of my stomach. Wyatt was ship's command. Wyatt was dead in the cockpit with his jaw sheared off. I didn't have his codes. I didn't have his retinal scan. The airlock door gave way with a deafening screech of tearing metal. I couldn't see them, but I could hear the heavy thud of their boots hitting the deck, the sharp guttural barks of their language echoing in the bay. Panic, raw and primal, cut through the chemical haze. I couldn't die here, not after all this. I grabbed the heavy metal emergency flashlight clipped to the bulkhead beside the seat. I didn't aim for the launch button. I aimed for the glass casing covering the manual, explosive bolt release. The system designed for catastrophic, complete electrical failure. I smashed the heavy handle of the flashlight into the glass. It spider-webbed, but held. Heavy footsteps approached the pod. The shadow of a massive armored figure fell across the hatchway. I swung again, putting every ounce of my remaining strength into the blow. The glass shattered, raining sharp fragments onto my lap. I jammed my bleeding fist into the housing and pulled the heavy red mechanical lever. There was no countdown, no warning hum, just a violent, concussive explosion as the pyrotechnic bolts holding the pod to the ship's hull detonated all at once. The sound was deafening, a physical blow that ruptured my other eardrum. The pod didn't just launch. It was violently ejected like a bullet from a chamber. The sudden brutal acceleration hit me before I could even reach for the crash webbing. Gravity turned into a solid, crushing wall of concrete. My body was slammed backward into the unyielding metal of the seat. The sheer G-force tore at my wounds. The half-formed clots in my chest ruptured simultaneously. I felt a hot, sickening rush of fluid as I began to hemorrhage all over again. Through the small, reinforced viewport, I saw the sleek, predatory hull of the alien cruiser shrinking rapidly, the jagged wound of our dying freighter attached to its flank like a parasite. Then, the blackness of deep space swallowed it all. I was out. I was flying, and I was bleeding to death in a tin can moving at 30,000 meters per second. Acceleration sickness is a miserable thing under normal circumstances. When your torso is a meat grinder of kinetic trauma, it transcends misery and becomes a profound spiritual punishment. The pod spun wildly, tumbling end over end because the explosive bolts hadn't detonated in perfect synchronization. The gyro shrieked in protest, trying to stabilize the trajectory. Inside, the artificial gravity was entirely disabled. I floated inches above the seat, anchored only by my broken body wedged awkwardly against the control console. Globules of my own blood drifted around the cabin in 0G. Perfect, horrifying little crimson spheres, catching the amber light. I needed to secure myself, but my arms felt like they were packed with wet sand. The biochem pump clicked again. It was a dry, hollow sound this time. The reservoir was nearly empty. It pushed a tertiary mix, mostly pure synthetic cortisol, and a cocktail of aggressive amphetamines designed to keep a soldier awake through traumatic amputation. My spine arched involuntarily as the drugs hit my nervous system. I let out a strangled, breathless scream. It felt like someone had wired my brain directly to a high-voltage battery. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, everything outside of my immediate focus blurring into static. With shaking, uncoordinated movements, I grabbed the crash webbing and pulled it over my shoulders. The buckle snapped into place with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the small space. I yanked the straps tight, crying out as the heavy nylon pressed directly against the entry wounds in my chest. "Proximity warning," the pod's computer stated evenly. I forced my heavy eyelids open and looked at the sensor readout. The tumbling had stopped, the gyros finally managing to orient the pod. On the small, cracked screen, a red triangle was separating from the mass of the alien cruiser. They had launched a pursuit craft. Of course they had. You don't leave a loose end tumbling through the void, especially not a loose end that just killed half your boarding party. "Time to intercept," I mumbled, my lips numb and rubbery. "Estimated time to intercept, 4 minutes, 20 seconds, the computer replied. "Warning, life support reserves at 18%. Hull integrity compromised. Medical intervention required immediately." I laughed, a dry, coughing sound that ended in a groan. Medical intervention. Right. Just let me pull a trauma surgeon out of the emergency ration kit. I stared at the console, my chemically fueled brain working in erratic, hyper-fast bursts. I couldn't outrun them. The escape pod's thrusters were designed for short-range maneuvering and deceleration, not outrunning a military interceptor. I couldn't fight them. I had no weapons, no shields, and a hull that was mostly recycled aluminum and prayer. I reached for the comms panel, my fingers leaving bloody smears on the dials. I tuned the frequency to the standard unencrypted emergency band. "Mayday! Mayday!" I rasped, thumbing the transmit button. "This is a distress call from the escape pod of the independent freighter Siren. I have been boarded by unknown hostiles. Crew is dead. I coughed, tasting copper. "I am severely wounded, require immediate assistance." I didn't expect an answer. We were in the deep dark, 3 jumps from the nearest civilized port. But I needed the interceptor to know I was transmitting. I needed them to think I was trying to call for the cavalry. The red triangle on the screen accelerated, closing the distance rapidly. They were burning hard. 3 minutes, the computer warned. I looked at the environmental controls. The pod had a standard array of emergency countermeasures. Flares, a distress beacon, and a small supply of radar-absorbent chaff designed to confuse automated targeting systems. None of it would stop a visual pursuit. But I wasn't trying to blind their sensors. I was trying to blind their pilot. I unbuckled the crash webbing, fighting back a wave of nausea as my body shifted. I drifted upward, grabbing the overhead handhold. I pulled myself toward the rear of the pod, where the small primary oxygen tank was housed. It was a stupid idea, a suicidal idea, but the pump in my chest was screaming at me to live, and it didn't care how ugly the method was. I found the heavy metal wrench clipped to the maintenance panel. I grabbed it, my knuckles white, and floated back to the primary console. I braced my feet against the bulkhead and raised the wrench, aiming for the main environmental control manifold. "Warning," the computer chimed. "Proximity alert. Hostile lock detected." They were going to tractor me in. They weren't going to blow me up. They wanted to know how I survived. They wanted the tech in my chest. I swung the wrench, smashing it into the plastic casing of the manifold. It shattered. I dug my fingers into the exposed wiring, ripping out a handful of fiber optics and power couplings. Spark showered over my hands, burning my skin, but the pain was distant, muted by the roaring chemical fire in my veins. The console sparked, sputtered, and died. The amber lights flickered out, plunging the pod into absolute suffocating darkness. "Life support offline," the computer's voice echoed, fading out as the backup battery kicked in. Cabin pressure dropping. I wasn't done. I fumbled in the dark, my hands slick with blood, until I found the manual release valve for the primary oxygen tank. I didn't open it a fraction. I cranked the heavy wheel all the way to the left, opening the valve completely. Pure, highly pressurized oxygen flooded the tiny cabin. The sound was a deafening roar. My ears popped painfully. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from the survival kit beneath the seat. I braced myself against the cold wall, aiming the bright orange plastic barrel squarely at the reinforced glass of the pod's main viewport. The interceptor was right outside. I could see the blinding glare of its spotlight sweeping across my hull. They thought I was dead in the water. They thought they had won. My thumb hovered over the firing mechanism. The air in the cabin was so thick with oxygen, it tasted sweet. I was going to blow the reinforced viewport outward, creating a massive, localized explosive decompression fueled by pure oxygen right in the face of their interceptor. It would likely shred my pod. It would definitely suck me out into the void. But it would take them with me. "Checkmate, you bastards," I whispered, and squeezed the trigger. Ignition happened in a fraction of a microsecond. Phosphorus from the emergency flare met the hyper-pressurized, pure oxygen environment of the cabin. It didn't burn. It detonated. A wall of blue-white fire materialized in front of me, so bright it burned an after-image into my retinas that I would see for days. The heat was instantaneous, a physical blow that singed the eyebrows off my face and flash-melted the synthetic fibers of my flight jacket. But I didn't hear the explosion. The reinforced viewport shattered outward, and in that exact millisecond, the atmosphere was violently sucked into the void. The sound was ripped away. One moment, the cabin was a roaring furnace of localized hellfire, and the next, absolute, suffocating silence. Decompression is not a gentle pulling sensation. It is the hand of an angry god, yanking you by the lungs. The air in my chest violently expanded. I had screamed right as I pulled the trigger, which was the only reason my lungs didn't rupture like overinflated balloons. Saliva boiled instantly on my tongue, turning into a freezing, bloody froth. I was violently sucked forward, tumbling through the jagged, sparking ring of what used to be the viewport. The shotgun blast of reinforced glass, propelled by the oxygen detonation, hit the alien interceptor point blank. At 30,000 meters per second, even a speck of paint is a deadly projectile. Hundreds of jagged fist-sized chunks of plexi steel slammed into the pursuit craft's sensor array and cockpit canopy. I saw the interceptor's floodlight shatter into 1,000 useless fragments. The sleek, predatory hull buckled under the kinetic impact, venting a massive, glowing plume of superheated plasma as its forward thruster manifold ruptured. The ship violently pitched upwards, spinning out of control into the dark, completely blinded and bleeding its own lifeblood into the vacuum. I didn't have time to celebrate. I was outside the pod, tumbling into the endless, uncaring black. The cold hit me. Space isn't just cold. It is the total absence of heat. A freezing void that immediately began to suck the thermal energy directly out of my blood. A violent jerk snapped my spine into a painful arch. I stopped tumbling. The crash webbing. When I unbuckled it, I had left it dangling, and during the explosive decompression, a heavy nylon strap had wrapped itself twice around my left ankle. I was tethered to the dead escape pod, dangling like a broken ornament on a rearview mirror. My flight suit's emergency protocols finally kicked in. A thin, pressurized mylar-laced hood deployed from my collar, snapping over my head and sealing around my neck with a tight, choking hiss. A tiny localized oxygen scrubber built into the lining hissed to life. It smelled like talcum powder, stale sweat, and ozone. It was barely enough to keep me conscious, let alone comfortable. I hung there in the absolute silence, spinning slowly at the end of the tether. Below me, or above me, direction meant nothing out here. The ruined interceptor spiraled into the distance, shrinking until it was just another dead star. The biochem pump beneath my sternum clicked, a dry, hollow sound. It vibrated uselessly, trying to pull from a reservoir that was completely dry. The artificial adrenaline, the neurostimulants, the clotting agents, they were all gone. The crash was catastrophic. Without the chemical cocktail propping up my nervous system, the true extent of my injuries crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsing star. Every nerve ending in my torso screamed simultaneously. The bullet holes in my chest and abdomen, previously numbed into a dull ache, flared into agonizing, white-hot localized fires. My broken collarbone grated with every erratic heartbeat. I could feel the blood pooling in my chest cavity, suffocating my remaining lung. I vomited, a pathetic wet heave of bile and blood that splattered against the inside of my emergency hood, obscuring my vision in a red, floating haze. I was dying. This time, there was no secret protocol to save me. I was just a slab of ruined meat, tethered to a piece of space junk, waiting for the cold to finish what the kinetics had started. I closed my eyes. The cynic in my brain didn't have any smart remarks left. It was just tired. I was so incredibly tired. The cold was creeping up my legs, turning my toes and calves into numb, heavy blocks of wood. It was a peaceful sort of dying, much better than bleeding out on the grating of the siren. I thought about Wyatt. I wondered if he had felt the console hit him, or if the lights had just gone out. I hoped it was the latter. A vibration traveled up the nylon tether, weak at first, then steady. A rhythmic thrumming that bypassed my ruptured eardrums and vibrated directly against my bones. I forced my heavy, blood-crusted eyelids open. I peered through the smeared gore on my mylar hood. The stars were blinking out. A massive, jagged shadow was moving across the star field, eclipsing the distant constellations. It wasn't a sleek military cruiser. It was a flying brick. It was scarred with micrometeoroid impacts, bristling with ugly, utilitarian communication arrays, and painted a dull, rust-colored orange. A deep space salvager. A high-intensity spotlight cut through the dark, blinding me, pinning my floating body in its harsh, unyielding glare. I felt a sudden, forceful pull on the tether. It wasn't the erratic spin of the pod. It was a tractor beam, heavy and magnetic, locking onto the pod's metallic hull and reeling us in. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel hope. I just felt a profound, overwhelming exhaustion as the darkness finally rose up to swallow me whole. Pain was no longer a signal. It was a geography, and I was trapped in the center of it. I didn't wake up so much as I slowly became aware of my own suffering. My first breath was a ragged, wet gasp that felt like pulling fiberglass through my trachea. I gagged, instinctively trying to sit up, but thick leather restraints dug into my wrists and ankles, pinning me to a hard, unyielding surface. "Don't fight it, kid. You'll just tear the staples." The voice was gravelly, stained with years of cheap tobacco and recycled air. I forced my eyes open. The overhead light was a single, flickering fluorescent bulb, buzzing with an irritating, high-pitched hum. The air smelled of industrial bleach, old blood, and engine grease. A far cry from the sterile, ozone-scented air of military medical bays. A face leaned into my field of vision. He was old, his skin heavily lined, and possessing that distinct grayish pallor common among belters who spent too long away from natural sunlight. He had grease under his fingernails and a pair of surgical magnifiers pushed up onto a balding forehead. "I'm Hobbs," he said, wiping a bloody wrench on a dirty rag. "And you are the unluckiest son of a bitch I've ever pulled out of the drift." I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert. Only a dry click emerged. Hobbs reached over, grabbing a squeeze tube of heavily mineralized water. He jammed the nozzle past my cracked lips. The water was lukewarm and tasted like copper piping, but it was the best thing I had ever swallowed. I coughed, pain flaring in my chest. "Easy," Hobbs grunted, pulling the tube away. "Your right lung is mostly surgical glue and prayer. You took 5 kinetic rounds to the torso, shattered collarbone, internal bleeding that would have drowned a horse. By all medical logic, you should be a frozen corpse." He paused, leaning closer, his eyes narrowing. "But you aren't, because of that thing bolted to your sternum." My chest throbbed. A phantom clicking echoed in my ears. The biochem pump. "I had to bypass it," Hobbs said, his tone shifting from casual mechanic to grim professional. "Whatever military black site engineered that little nightmare didn't build it to save your life. They built it to keep you fighting until the meat literally tore itself apart. It dumped so much synthetic epinephrine into your system that your heart muscle is scarred. You tore your own tendons right off the bone just moving around." I closed my eyes. The memories hit me, not in a coherent sequence, but in flashes of pure sensory overload. The smell of burning alien flesh when the nitrogen line ruptured. The sickening wet crunch of the soldier's jaw beneath my knee. The feral, unhinged roaring in my ears as I pulled the trigger of the stolen rifle. I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a monster waking up from a blackout, terrified of what the blood on my hands meant. "Who are you?" I rasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Independent salvage," Hobbs replied, tossing the rag onto a metal tray. "Ship's called the Rust Bucket. Accurate, if unoriginal. We picked up your distress signal, saw the explosion, found you dangling from a piece of scrap metal like a worm on a hook. The interceptor, drifting, vented its main drive. They won't be bothering anyone anytime soon." Hobbs crossed his arms, leaning back against a bulkhead cluttered with rusty tools and medical supplies. "Now, you want to tell me why a corporate freighter pilot is carrying restricted, experimental military hardware in his chest? And why a highly trained boarding party from a species we aren't even officially at war with decided to turn your ship into Swiss cheese?" I stared at the flickering light above. I thought about Wyatt. I thought about the cargo we were hauling. A routine shipment of industrial superconductors. Nothing worth killing for, nothing worth dying for, unless it wasn't about the cargo. "I don't know," I whispered, and the terrifying part was, it was the truth. They just started shooting, the pump. It was standard issue for frontier routes. A contingency, that's what command called it. Hobbs snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. "Contingency. That's a polite word for a suicide engine. You realize what you did to them out there? We pulled the black box logs from your pod. You fought off a heavily armored squad barehanded and blew a pressure vessel in a pursuit craft's face." I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. I didn't want to be the hero of this story. I was just a guy who wanted to fly freighters, get paid, and drink cheap beer on shore leave. The violence inside me, the absolute ruthless brutality the protocol had unlocked, terrified me. It wasn't me, but it was my hands that had done it. "I just wanted to live," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Yeah, well," Hobbs sighed, stepping forward and checking the IV line snaking into my left arm. "You got your wish, but you're a mess, kid. The adrenaline hangover is going to make you wish you were dead for the next week. You're going to shake, you're going to sweat, and you're going to have nightmares that'll make you scream until you cough up blood." He unbuckled the leather strap across my right wrist. "Rest up. We're burning for the nearest neutral station. You can figure out who wants you dead and why they're willing to start a galactic incident over it, when you can walk without your chest cavity collapsing." Hobbs turned and hit the heavy iron door of the medbay. It slid shut with a grinding squeal, leaving me alone with the buzzing light and the steady, agonizing thrum of my own ruined heart. I stared at my freed hand. It was wrapped in thick, white gauze, but underneath I could feel the torn skin of my knuckles. I slowly closed it into a fist. It hurt. It hurt so much I wanted to cry, but I was breathing. And for now, in the cold, uncaring dark of the universe, that was going to have to be enough. Sweat pooled in the hollow of my throat, thick and cold. The withdrawal hit during the second sleep cycle, and it didn't come on gradually. It kicked the door down. My body was violently protesting the sudden absence of the chemical cocktail that had kept me alive. My nervous system, previously flooded with military-grade amphetamines and synthetic cortisol, was suddenly running on empty, trying to bridge the gap over blown-out neural pathways. My hands shook so badly that the heavy canvas blanket covering me audibly rustled against the mattress. I clenched my teeth, trying to stifle the pathetic, wet groans clawing their way up my throat, but the shivering was uncontrollable. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on the siren. I could smell the ruptured sewage lines. I could feel the hot, sticky spray of Wyatt's blood across the side of my face. I saw the tinted visor of the boarding marine, saw the exact moment the supercooled liquid nitrogen flash froze his armor, peeling his skin back in brittle, blackened sheets. My heart would seize, slamming against my battered ribs, expecting the phantom click of the pump to save me. But there was no click, just a hollow, aching silence beneath my sternum, and a pain so profound it felt like gravity itself was crushing my chest. Hobbs didn't offer pity. Pity didn't fix broken things. He just came in every 4 hours, checked the surgical glue holding my right lung intact, and forced me to swallow nutrient paste that tasted like chalk and fish oil. "Eat it," he grunted during the third cycle, shoving a plastic spoon against my cracked lips. "Your metabolism is cannibalizing your muscle tissue just to repair the bullet holes. If you don't get calories in, your heart is going to quit out of spite." I swallowed the paste, gagging as it hit the back of my dry throat. "How long?" I rasped. My voice sounded entirely foreign to me, thin, reedy, and broken. "Until we hit the station, 2 days. Hobbs wiped his grease-stained hands on his overalls and pulled up a rusted folding chair beside the cot. It squealed in protest under his weight. "Until you stop shaking? Probably a month, assuming you live that long." He reached into the deep pocket of his coveralls and pulled out a battered, heavily modified datapad. The screen was cracked, spider-webbed with impact fractures, but the display glowed with a harsh green light. He tossed it onto my stomach. I winced as the plastic corner dug into a bruised rib. "I managed to crack the encryption on your pod's black box," Hobbs said, pulling a crushed cigar from his pocket and rolling it between his teeth unlit. "And I pulled the partial manifest data that uploaded when you initiated the emergency launch sequence." "You want to tell me what you were actually hauling, kid?" I frowned, my vision swimming slightly as I tried to focus on the small green text scrolling across the screen. Superconductors, Class 4 industrial, routine supply run for a mining colony in the outer rim. Bullshit, Hobbs said flatly. He tapped a sequence of keys on his own wrist comp. The data on my screen shifted. The standard corporate shipping manifests melted away, revealing a secondary, deeply hidden subdirectory stamped with the insignia of a private military contractor. Superconductors don't require biostasis fields, Hobbs pointed out, his voice low and dangerous in the quiet hum of the medbay. And they sure as hell don't require a military-grade encryption lock that took my ship's mainframe 6 hours to brute force. You weren't hauling industrial supplies, you were hauling organic material, specifically synthetic endocrine glands, thousands of them. The small, cramped room suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I stared at the text. Project Lazarus, Batch 44. They were pumps, I whispered, the realization settling into my gut like a block of lead. Just like the one in my chest. Exactly. Hobbs leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Your corporate bosses didn't give you that little piece of hardware out of the goodness of their hearts. They didn't care if you survived a pirate attack. You were a field test, a proof of concept with a pulse. And your cargo hold was filled with the production model. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The unprovoked attack, the highly trained boarding party, the fact that they didn't just blow the siren out of the sky with a torpedo, but went through the incredibly dangerous process of clamping on and cutting through the hull. They didn't want to destroy the freighter. They wanted to steal the shipment, and they wanted to see the tech in action. I was just the guard dog, a disposable variable in a corporate espionage war I didn't even know I was fighting. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in my chest. It bypassed the withdrawal shakes and cut straight through the pain of my shattered collarbone. It was a purely human rage, unassisted by synthetic adrenaline, born from the absolute indignity of being used as a disposable petri dish. Command knew, I said, my voice steadying for the first time in days. They put me and Wyatt on that route knowing it was compromised. They wanted a field demonstration. Looks like it, Hobbs agreed, chewing on his unlit cigar. And you gave them one hell of a show. But here's the problem, kid. The people who hit your ship, the ones you turned into space dust, they aren't going to just write this off as a loss. You took out a highly specialized wet work team and vaporized an interceptor. They are going to be looking for you, and when we dock at Kessler Station, if they have listeners on the comboys, they are going to know exactly where you are. I looked down at my hands. The skin across my knuckles was still raw, scabbed over in ugly dark red patches where I had beaten a man to death. I didn't want to fight anymore. I just wanted to sleep. Then why are you taking me there? I asked. Hobbs stood up, grabbing the empty nutrient tube from the metal tray. Because Kessler is a wretched hive of smugglers and cutthroats, and it's the only place in this sector where a man with a military black box and a chest full of stolen tech can disappear. But you have to be able to walk off this ship on your own 2 feet. So stop shaking, kid. We dock in 48 hours. Kessler Station didn't orbit a planet. It clung to the dead, frozen husk of a hollowed-out asteroid like a metallic parasite. The docking sequence jarred my teeth. The rust bucket shuddered violently as the heavy magnetic clamps locked onto the airlock ring, sending a shockwave through the deck plates that traveled directly up my spine. I gripped the edge of the steel examination table, knuckles white, biting back a groan. Hobbs had wrapped my ribs in a rigid, synthetic polymer cast that felt like wearing a corset made of concrete. My shattered collarbone was pinned beneath a heavy magnetic brace, restricting my right arm to a useless, rigid angle against my stomach. Every breath was a shallow, measured exercise in pain management. "Here," Hobbs grunted, tossing a bundle of dark gray fabric onto the table beside me. "Put these on. Your flight suit looks like it went through a meat grinder, and corporate colors are a good way to get a knife in your kidney on the promenade." I unfolded the clothes, a heavy, grease-stained canvas jacket and loose drab cargo pants. They smelled like engine coolant and stale sweat, but they were thick enough to hide the bulky medical braces holding my upper body together. Dressing took 20 agonizing minutes. Moving my left arm to pull the fabric over my right shoulder sent blinding flashes of heat through my neck. By the time I managed to zip the jacket, I was drenched in a cold, clammy sweat, my breathing reduced to a rapid, painful wheeze. I looked like a drifter, a broken dock worker down on his luck. It was the perfect disguise. "Take these," Hobbs said, pressing a small, unmarked plastic bottle into my good hand. "Heavy-duty nerve blockers. Don't take more than 2 every 6 hours, or your liver will shut down. They won't stop the pain, but they'll keep you from screaming when you walk." I popped the cap with my thumb and swallowed 2 of the thick white pills dry. They tasted bitter and chalky. Hobbs slung a heavy canvas duffel bag over his shoulder. Inside was the encrypted data drive from my escape pod, wrapped in a lead-lined pouch to prevent passive scanning. "Stick close to me," he ordered, racking the slide of a heavy, snub-nosed kinetic pistol and sliding it into his waistband. "Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact with the locals. And for the love of God, try not to look like you're bleeding to death." The airlock cycled open with a heavy, pneumatic hiss. The smell of Kessler Station hit me like a physical blow. It was an assault of cheap, synthetic ozone, frying grease from street vendors, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of cheap narcotic smoke. The corridor beyond the airlock was dimly lit by flickering neon strips, the metal walls scarred by years of graffiti, laser burns, and general neglect. I took my first step off the ship. My knee buckled slightly, but I locked the joint, forcing my weight forward. The artificial gravity on the station was set slightly higher than standard, pulling at my injured chest with relentless pressure. We merged into the flow of foot traffic on the main promenade. The crowd was a chaotic mix of humans and aliens, dock workers in heavy exosuits, scavengers dragging carts of scrap, and heavily armed mercenaries lounging against the bulkheads. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of shouting vendors, grinding machinery, and blaring advertisements from overhead screens. I kept my chin tucked into the high collar of the canvas jacket, my eyes fixed on the scuffed heels of Hobbs' heavy boots. Every jostle from a passing shoulder sent a spike of agony through my ribs. The nerve blockers were barely taking the edge off. I felt like I was walking on broken glass. "Where are we going?" I muttered, my voice barely audible over the din of the promenade. "Lower levels," Hobbs replied without turning around, weaving expertly through a group of drunken miners. "Got a contact named Rourke. Used to do data extraction for the syndicates before he burned his optic nerves. If anyone can rip the rest of the telemetry data off your corporate masters without tripping a tracking beacon, it's him." We descended a rusted metal staircase into the underbelly of the station. The air grew colder, thicker, with the smell of damp rot and leaking coolant. The crowds thinned out. replaced by shadowed figures lingering in alleyways between shipping containers. The paranoia started to creep in. It wasn't the chemical anxiety of the withdrawal. It was a primal, cold instinct. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel eyes on me. I glanced up, sweeping my gaze across the upper gantry overlooking our path. Nothing, just a few flickering floodlights and tangled bundles of fiber optic cables. But the feeling remained, a heavy, suffocating weight. "Hobbs," I hissed, forcing myself to walk faster, my boots dragging slightly on the grated floor. "Keep moving," he muttered back, his hand dropping subtly toward the grip of the pistol at his waist. "Don't look up." He felt it too. We turned down a narrow, claustrophobic corridor lined with heavy, reinforced blast doors. The lighting here was almost non-existent, reliant on the dull, ambient glow of emergency floor strips. As we approached a door marked with the faded number 404, a shadow detached itself from the alcove directly across from it. The figure stepped into the dim light. He wasn't a scavenger. He was wearing a high-end, tailored tactical suit, devoid of any corporate insignia, but humming with the faint blue glow of active kinetic shielding. His face was human, but his eyes were entirely black, cybernetic replacements designed for low-light targeting. "Mr. Hobbs," the man said. His voice was perfectly smooth, unnervingly calm. "And the miraculous survivor. Command sends their regards." Two more figures stepped out from the intersecting corridor behind us, heavy kinetic rifles already raised and leveled at our backs. My heart stumbled in my chest. The empty biochem pump beneath my sternum gave a pathetic, phantom click. We hadn't outrun them. They were waiting for us. Sweat stung my eyes, acidic and cold. The humming of the man's kinetic shield was a low, vibrating frequency that made my dental fillings ache. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like an auditor, someone who analyzed spreadsheets and calculated acceptable losses. To him, my life, Wyatt's life, the destruction of the siren, it was all just data points on a profit and loss statement. "Hand over the drive, Mr. Hobbs," the corporate suit said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "And the pilot. The hardware in his chest is proprietary property of Apex Solutions. You are currently in possession of stolen corporate assets." Hobbs didn't flinch. He just chewed slowly on his unlit cigar, his eyes darting between the suit in front of us and the two riflemen blocking our retreat. "Proprietary property," Hobbs repeated, his gravelly voice echoing in the narrow, rusting corridor. "Funny way to describe a meat grinder bolted to a man's ribs." My breathing was a shallow, ragged whistle. The nerve blockers were working, but only to a point. They dulled the sharp edges of the agony, turning the shattered collarbone and torn lung into a vast, suffocating pressure. I couldn't fight. I could barely stand upright in Kessler's heavy gravity. If bullets started flying, I was a static target, nothing more than a liability. Hobbs spat his cigar onto the grated floor. "Kid," he muttered, so low I barely heard it over the hum of the station's ventilation. "Drop." I didn't hesitate. I let my knees give out, collapsing against the cold, damp wall of the corridor, just as the deafening roar of kinetic gunfire erupted. Hobbs didn't aim for the men. He aimed his heavy, snub-nosed pistol straight up at the ceiling overhead. 3 shots, fast and deafening, shattering the primary halide light strips and ripping through the massive pressurized coolant main running along the roof. Total darkness fell in a microsecond, instantly followed by the shrieking hiss of aerosolized freon venting at high pressure. A thick, blinding white fog filled the corridor, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees in a heartbeat. Laser sights cut through the dense chemical smoke like angry red razor blades. The riflemen fired blindly, the heavy slugs sparking off the metal bulkheads, deafening in the confined space. I stayed low, pressing my good cheek against the freezing metal grate of the floor. My right arm was pinned uselessly against my chest by the magnetic brace. I dragged myself backward with my left hand, gasping as the toxic coolant stung my eyes and throat. Every movement felt like dragging my body over a bed of hot coals. A heavy boot slammed onto my ankle, pinning me to the floor. I looked up. The suit stood over me. His kinetic shield was flaring a brilliant, angry blue as it repelled the ambient chemical fog. His black, cybernetic eyes whirred, focusing on me through the smoke with terrifying clarity. Low-light optics. The coolant didn't blind him at all. He reached down, his grip locking onto the collar of my canvas jacket. He lifted me effortlessly with one hand. The synthetic cast around my ribs cracked ominously under the pressure. I choked, my feet dangling inches off the ground, a fresh wave of nausea washing over me. "The test data is secondary," the suit said calmly, pulling a short, serrated vibroblade from his sleeve. The metal hummed with a high-frequency vibration that blurred the air around the edge. "The physical pump is the primary asset. I will extract it now." Panic, pure and chemical-free, flooded my system. It wasn't the artificial courage of the adrenaline protocol. It was the raw, desperate terror of a trapped animal. I didn't have the strength to break his grip. I didn't have a weapon. My body was an exhausted, broken vessel, but I had my left hand, and I had a head full of violent, frantic static. I didn't swing at his face. His kinetic shield would just absorb the blow and throw me backward, shattering my wrist in the process. I looked at the heavy pulsing node on his collar, the shield's main projection emitter. I drove my left thumb forward with every ounce of desperate strength I possessed, jamming it not into the shield itself, but directly into the emitter module mounted on his armored lapel. The module sparked. The suit grunted in surprise, trying to pull back, but I hooked my fingers around the rigid casing of his armor, holding myself against him. I dug my thumb deeper, tearing my own fingernail off on the metal housing, searching blindly for the delicate fiber optic wiring underneath. My thumb found the primary power coupling. I ripped it outward in a brutal, jagged motion. The kinetic shield didn't just fail, it short-circuited. The stored kinetic energy violently discharged inward. The blue light flashed blindingly bright, accompanied by the sickening smell of roasting flesh and burning ozone. The suit convulsed. A wet, bubbling sound escaped his lips. The feedback loop of the shorted shield fried the cybernetic implants in his skull, blowing out his artificial eyes in a shower of sparks and black fluid. He dropped me like a stone. I hit the deck hard. My rib brace splintered, and a white-hot spike of agony drove itself straight through my chest. I couldn't breathe. My right lung felt like it had collapsed all over again. I rolled onto my side, coughing up a mouthful of thick, coppery blood onto the grating. Through the dissipating coolant fog, I heard two more heavy thuds. Hobbs emerged from the smoke, his face smeared with grease and a fresh, bleeding graze across his left cheek. He kicked the twitching body of the corporate suit away from me, his pistol smoking in the dim emergency lighting. "Told you to keep your head down, kid," Hobbs wheezed, grabbing the back of my jacket and hauling me upright with a grunt of effort. I screamed, a pathetic, broken sound that echoed in the corridor. The pain was absolute. It swallowed me, turning the world into a spinning vortex of gray static and flashing red lights. The heavy steel door of room 404 hissed open behind us. A gaunt man with heavy neural jacks drilled directly into his temples stood in the doorway, a heavy sawed-off shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. Rourke. "You're making a hell of a lot of noise, Hobbs," Rourke drawled, stepping aside. "Get us inside," Hobbs growled, dragging me over the threshold. "And lock it down. We've got corporate heat." The heavy blast door slid shut with a definitive clang, plunging us into a dimly lit sanctuary of humming servers, tangled wires, and stale air. I collapsed against a stack of metal crates, sliding down to the cold floor. My chest heaved. I stared at my left hand, the thumb bloody, raw, and missing its nail. I was alive. I wasn't a hero, and I wasn't a monster. I was just a pilot with a chest full of stolen ghosts, hiding in the dark fringes of the galaxy. There was no going back to the freight routes. No more cheap beer on shore leave. The siren was gone. Wyatt was gone. My old life was dead and buried. But as I sat there, breathing in the smell of hot copper and ozone, feeling the agonizing, beautiful beat of my own ruined heart, I knew one thing for certain. They were going to have to work a lot harder if they wanted to kill me. Blood, chrome, and a desperate fight for survival. That's just another Tuesday in the deep dark. If this gritty, adrenaline-soaked ride kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button to let the algorithm know you want more raw sci-fi action. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a pulse-pounding chapter on this channel. Drop a comment below